Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we're going to be talking about the comeback album from Sleater-Kinney titled No Cities to Love. So let's talk a little bit about comeback, shall we? Now, if you're familiar with sites like BuzzFeed at all, and if you're online, you've probably been linked to one of their advertisements masquerading as a list, masquerading as legitimate content at some point, you're probably aware that there's a certain market for nostalgic material. Now, to be fair, this is nothing new. Artists have always had a fondness for looking back or improving upon or innovating upon the material of those that came before, or at the very least, subverting or satirizing it, and people will buy that. But the rise of the internet and nerd culture means that it's much easier to read something really tangible out of that market. And since we're currently riding something of a 90s nostalgia wave in indie music, most of which was influenced by the 70s, which is influenced by the 50s, and all of it is partially driven by whatever's in the underground at the time, but that's besides the point, we've seen a slew of artists that were very prominent in the 90s make something of a comeback over the past couple of years across a number of genres. But even as it can be a very easy paycheck for the artist, I'm always a little bit wary of comebacks driven off of nostalgia, especially in this vein. For one, it's very rare that an artist will pick up where they left off in terms of their sound, or aim to experiment further. After all, that'll push that treasured fan base away unless you can absolutely guarantee success, and oftentimes you can't. So oftentimes you get artists that stick pretty close to their comfort zone with their comeback records, which is fine. You can give the fans exactly what they want, but it's really all that challenging or interesting or potent, which can detract from their earlier work. But even with that qualification, I gotta admit, I had really high hopes here. I've talked a little bit about Sleater-Kinney when I reviewed the debut album from X-Hex called Rips last year, but that was more of a Merry Timony project. Sleater-Kinney is more of the brainchild of Carrie Brownstein and Corin Tucker, who along with drummer Janet Weiss managed to craft several great punk and art rock records across the 90s and early 2000s before going on hiatus. And while I won't subscribe to the hyperbole from sites like Vox saying that Sleater-Kinney is the last great rock band or some clickbait headline like that, I will say that with records like All Hands on the Bad One, Dig Me Out, One Beat, and The Woods, that they made some stellar, insightful, incredibly well-written records that I really do enjoy. Yet even with all that, at the back of my mind, I was uneasy about this comeback. It wasn't just that Sleater-Kinney has a really passionate fan base that would buy that comeback record in a heartbeat, but Carrie Brownstein could easily use her cult comedy TV show Portlandia for free marketing. In other words, this was something of a guaranteed investment, and given that I wasn't exactly expecting offbeat experimentation to follow off of The Woods, they could have easily just made this just pure fan service. But you know what, even with that, I'm still a fan of Sleater-Kinney, so I made sure to give No Cities to Love a lot of listens. How is it? Well, it's very much like I was expecting, in that it's not exactly challenging or incredibly innovative on the surface, but Sleater-Kinney does enough to distinguish their comeback album lyrically and instrumentally from their past discography to definitely make it a worthwhile listen. So yeah, No Cities to Love, damn good record, and will likely please the majority of their fans. And yet, at the end of the day, I feel very similar to when I reviewed Aphex Twin's Cyro, and that as good as it is, it's the sort of comeback record that doesn't seem to exactly take a lot of chances, which means it's got a slice of some great songs, but nothing that ever really blew my mind or something that I would brand as exceptional, at least on the surface. So let's start with what you would expect from Sleater-Kinney, because say what you will about them, they are at least consistent across their entire discography in terms of their sound. Janet Weiss's drumming is methodical but explosive, Corin Tucker's down-tuned guitar gives the songs plenty of foundation operating in a bass roll while still forming really solid grooves, and there's still a focus on melody throughout the songs that I've always loved. Now the big changes, they come in the details. While there's still blocky distortion on the guitars, the tone's a lot brighter and less intensely abrasive. It's easily their most accessible album in years, hell, probably their entire career, at least instrumentally, with cleaner production and grooves that are more jittery than the roiling crush of The Woods. Now this brings in somewhat mixed results for me, because while you might get melodically solid riffs like the starkly memorable Price Tag, the restraint and great guitar interplay of the title track, the hook-driven scratch of A New Wave, the seething, almost post-hardcore menace of No Anthems, or the oily chugging groove of Bury Our Friends, but then you also get songs like the frantic skitter of Fangless, the melodically overwritten and messy Surface Envy, or the staccato sputter of Give Me Love that just don't really work as well as they should. It becomes more of an issue in the guitar solos. The rougher, stiffer guitar tone that Sleater-Kinney chose works great for the heavier, chunkier grooves, and yet most of the actual technique of their playing focus more on scale progressions or flutters, and thus whenever a fast-picked solo comes up, it just comes across as a little bit messy to me. And what grooves we do get often aren't given the same chance to really simmer or really show off the composition. Now, a prime example of this is the album closer Fade, which really is the only track that feels like it could have possibly come off of The Woods, with the minor keys, the thicker reverb, and the slower tempo, and yet midway through the song, it shifts into this stuttering riff that almost feels like a post-punk riff, and yet the vocal filter and that really runny tone they chose for the guitar solo was incredibly unflattering. I'm sorry, did not fit whatsoever. So okay, what about the vocals? Well, like with the instrumentation, they tend towards being a little bit more accessible than the snarled monster that was the Woods. I'll admit to liking Corn Tucker's voice a little bit more than Brownstein's here, especially on this album with the lighter tone, but they've always had great interplay, and while we don't get as many harmonies as I'd always prefer, they still bring a lot of plucky, ragged energy that was definitely appreciated. And with the vocals being more prominent, it also gives the listener plenty of opportunity to delve really deeply into the lyrics, which has always been a major selling point for Sleater-Kinney, and I have always liked their songwriting. Not just because of the uncanny knack for empathy and displaying rough-edge vulnerability, but also for crafting stories that might have a lot of lurid imagery. It's pretty evocative, but it can also seem intensely relatable, mostly because they're not shy about including themselves in their messages and in their framing, which I really like. So okay, what topics are Sleater-Kinney tackling this time? Well, as expected, there are your songs focused on the band's reunion and their place in music today. But it's the framing of the situation of where it gets kinda interesting. For one, the band is not content to rest on their laurels, instead almost seeming to treat their past like an anchor holding them back on surface envy, and the disdain they have for their idols once revered for becoming set in their ways on Fagless. And yet with songs like the title track and Price Tag, and especially on Bury Your Friends, they show that despite how suffocating and claustrophobic a normal routine or a legacy can be, it also has a certain security to it that can be kind of seductive. And you know what, that's true. People default towards established systems because they provide the illusion of comfort, and yet under closer examination they can just completely fall apart so quickly. The title track is a prime example. Delving into why did people become too attached to certain cities with the excuses becoming thinner and thinner, and a damning indictment against settling down in that environment, which is a little bit ironic considering Carrie Brownstein's objections to touring, but whatever. Go deeper and you can see that Sleater-Kinney's true enemy isn't so much the system as it is stasis and inertia, and yet acknowledging all the way throughout this album how hard it can be to break out of it once you settle in, especially when that change can invite mistrust or anger from others or even from yourself. But there is power in that change and constant evolution, and there's a real populist edge when they say that while people can build the systems that subsequently imprison them, they can also break those systems. Now sure, you won't have the same security or be forced towards obscurity or possibly the lowest possible methods to appeal, but it's definitely preferable to getting locked into a system and a routine that will eventually strip away your individuality and real soul. But here's the funny thing. Sleater-Kinney pushed a message on this record screaming for change, subverting and breaking the system at every turn, disparaging their hidebound idols and burning those that would lock you down, and standing firm against the suggestive illusion of structure. Those are the main themes, and they did it with their most accessible, normal sounding record to date. And believe it or not, I'd argue that's intentional. After all, what better way to enhance your populism in your sound to greater appeal than to smuggle a subversive message into your lyrics? And with their knack of details that some would consider mundane, almost folk-inspired, they could strike even more of a chord with a larger audience. In a way, they flipped my original criticism of not being blown away by innovation on this record on its head, because you know what? That sort of sonic innovation wasn't the point. They were reaching for a larger audience and then trying to subvert it lyrically, which I really do respect. So at the end of the day, how do I feel about No Cities to Love? Well, there are moments that really do strike a chord with me. I will admit, though, that I was hoping deeper down that Sleater-Kinney would continue on the direction of the Woods and go even darker. But you know what? There's a different sort of innovation on this album in subverting what is considered normal. And while it doesn't quite hit me as hard as some of their more visceral work, I don't see it unseating any of their real classic records for me. But you know what? It's still a respectable and thought-provoking album that I can see winning the band a lot of new fans. And you know, I think I'll take back what I said earlier. This record is indeed challenging, but more for fans with expectations of how they expected Sleater-Kinney would sound than for new arrivals who've never heard anything before. Which might be extremely meta in context of the album, but it kind of makes sense in a twisted sort of way. So for me, I'm thinking a very light 8 out of 10, and definitely a recommendation if you're a fan of feminist-themed punk rock, or even if you're just looking for some music that is guaranteed to keep you thinking. If you're a fan, this record might demand a little bit to really get into, as it did for me. But you know what? Trust me on this, it's worth it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything else I might be able to do to improve your presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.